The morning sun filtered through my kitchen window, casting warm patches of light across the worn tile floor of my modest single-story home. I had purchased this house in Oak Ridge Estates 3 years ago, after 20 years of saving while working as an electrical engineer at the local utility company. It was not grand by any measurement, but it was mine, and after losing Linda to cancer last year, it represented everything I had left in the world. I poured myself a cup of coffee and gazed out at my backyard, where the garden project I had started 2 months ago was beginning to take shape. Linda had always wanted a garden with a stone pathway lined with her favorite David Austin roses and a small pond in the center. I never had time to build it while she was alive, something I regretted deeply. This garden was my way of keeping her memory alive, my silent promise that I would finally create the space she had dreamed about. The neighborhood itself was pleasant enough on the surface. Neat rows of homes built in the early 2000s, well-maintained common areas, and friendly enough neighbors who kept to themselves. I had a nodding acquaintance with most of them. There was Bill next door who worked nights as a security guard, the young couple with twins across the street, and several retirees who spent their mornings walking small dogs around the neighborhood. That morning, as I carried my coffee outside to check on the rose bushes I had planted the previous weekend, I noticed the neighborhood bulletin board had a fresh batch of notices pinned to it. The Oak Ridge Homeowners Association was notorious for its strict regulations and hefty fines. I had heard stories from Bill about how the previous HOA board had been reasonable, but the new leadership had turned unusually aggressive about enforcement over the past year. I remember the first time I encountered Corinne Peterson. It was during my second week in the neighborhood. I had left my garbage can at the curb 3 hours past the designated removal time because of an emergency call from work. When I returned home, there she was, standing in my driveway with a clipboard, her silver bob haircut not moving an inch despite the breeze, her thin lips pressed together in disapproval. "Containers must be removed from street view by 8 p.m. on collection day," she had said without introducing herself. "This is your first warning. The next one comes with a $50 fine." She handed me a yellow slip of paper and walked away before I could explain, her sensible shoes clicking rhythmically on the pavement. At the time, I had simply shrugged it off as an overzealous neighbor. I had no idea that this small interaction was the first drop in what would become a flood of trouble. I had no idea who Corinne Peterson really was or what position of power she held in our community. I simply filed away the warning notice and continued settling into my new home, focusing on healing from my loss and building Linda's garden one stone at a time. The HOA regulations seemed excessive but manageable. No parking on the street overnight. No exterior modifications without prior approval. Lawns must be mowed weekly during growing season. Houses must be painted in approved color schemes. The list went on, but none of it concerned me much at the time. My focus was inward, on my home and my garden, not on neighborhood politics or property values. If only I had known what was brewing beneath the peaceful surface of Oak Ridge Estates. If only I had recognized the warning signs in those early days. Perhaps I could have prevented what was to come. But like the water pipes that ran silently beneath our yards, carrying the lifeblood of our homes, the currents of conflict were already flowing, unseen but powerful, waiting to erupt. As spring progressed into summer, my backyard transformation gained momentum. The garden was becoming more than just a project. It was my therapy, my connection to Linda. Each flower I planted, each stone I laid in the pathway felt like a conversation with her. I had installed a small bench beneath the shade of the maple tree where I could sit in the evenings and feel at peace for the first time since her passing. The centerpiece of the garden was to be a small pond with a circulating fountain. I had researched water features extensively, and decided on a natural design with river rocks and aquatic plants. The sound of flowing water reminded me of our vacations to mountain streams, where Linda would sit for hours watching the patterns in the current. To create this special feature, I needed to run a water line from the main house supply to the center of the garden. One Saturday morning, as I was marking the ground where the pipe would run, a shadow fell across my work. I looked up to find Corinne Peterson standing at the edge of my property, her arms crossed over her chest, clipboard clutched in one manicured hand. Today she wore a blue pantsuit that seemed excessive for weekend wear, complete with a pearl necklace and the silver K charm pinned to her bob haircut. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, not bothering with a greeting, "are you aware that all landscaping modifications require prior HOA approval?" Her voice carried the false sweetness of artificial sugar, pleasant on the surface but leaving a bitter aftertaste. I stood slowly, brushing dirt from my knees. "Good morning, Mrs. Peterson. This is just a small garden project. I did not think it required approval since it is in my backyard and not visible from the street." Corinne's eyebrows rose slightly. Section 7, Paragraph 3 of our covenant clearly states that any alterations to the landscape, including backyard modifications, must be submitted in writing with detailed plans for board approval. She handed me a form from her clipboard. "This includes water features, which are subject to additional restrictions due to safety concerns and potential mosquito breeding." I accepted the form politely but felt a flicker of irritation. "I will look into it. Thank you for letting me know." Later that day, I reviewed the HOA covenant and discovered that Corinne was technically correct, though the rules seemed designed for major landscaping changes, not personal gardens. Still, wanting to avoid conflict, I completed the form, attached a simple drawing of my garden plan, and submitted it to the HOA Dropbox the following day. 2 weeks passed with no response. My garden sat in limbo, half finished. When I finally received a letter from the HOA, it contained not approval but a request for additional documentation, including professional hydrological assessment of the water feature's impact on adjacent properties. The requirements seemed deliberately excessive for a small backyard pond. Over the next month, Corinne's presence became increasingly intrusive. She appeared regularly at my fence line, documenting perceived violations with her camera and clipboard. My garden hose left uncoiled for an hour, a wheelbarrow visible from certain angles, plant varieties not on the approved vegetation list. Each incident resulted in a notice in my mailbox, each more formal and threatening than the last. One evening, as I was trimming some bushes, Bill leaned over our shared fence. "I see you have attracted Corinne's attention," he said quietly, glancing around as if worried about being overheard. "Word of advice: either fall completely in line or prepare for war. There is no middle ground with her." Bill explained that Corinne Peterson was not just any HOA member but the president, having maneuvered into the position 18 months ago after organizing a campaign against the previous board. Since then, violation notices had increased by 300%, and several homeowners had been forced to pay significant fines or face liens on their properties. "She has a pattern," Bill whispered. "She targets one homeowner at a time, makes an example of them, then moves on to the next. Jenkins' family moved out after she fined them thousands over their son's basketball hoop. The Martinez family before you, driven out over unapproved window treatments." Bill's expression grew serious. "Watch yourself. She does not fight fair." The following weekend, while digging the trench for my water line, I made an unexpected discovery. Just below the surface, running diagonally across my backyard, was a 6-inch water main pipe. According to the property diagrams I had received at purchase, This pipe connected to the main water supply for the entire eastern section of the neighborhood. I carefully worked around it, making note of its location so I would not damage it with my digging. That evening, as I was covering my tools, Karen appeared again, this time with another board member in tow. She pointed to my excavation work with obvious disapproval. "This unauthorized work stops immediately," she declared. "You are dangerously close to utility lines and violating multiple sections of the covenant." I tried to explain that I had checked the property diagrams and was being careful, but Karen cut me off. "We have documented your violations. Expect formal notification of fines by the end of the week." Her tone left no room for discussion as she turned and walked away, her companion following like an obedient shadow. Later that night, I received an email from an anonymous neighbor warning me that Karen had specifically mentioned my property at the last board meeting, calling it a situation that needs to be addressed aggressively. The neighbor advised caution, saying that Karen seemed to have made me her new target. As I sat on my half-finished garden bench that evening, surrounded by Linda's partially planted roses and the unfinished pond, I felt the first real stirrings of concern. What had started as a healing project was becoming a source of new stress, and I had no idea how far Karen was willing to go to assert her authority. The official violation notices began arriving with alarming frequency. Each came in the same crisp white envelope with the Oak Ridge HOA logo in the corner, each detailing alleged infractions of increasingly obscure covenant provisions. The most recent notice listed 7 violations, including improper soil displacement, unapproved irrigation modification, and aesthetic inconsistency with neighborhood standards. The combined fines totaled $750, with an additional $50 accruing daily until the issues were remediated to board satisfaction. I stared at the papers spread across my kitchen table, my hands trembling slightly. This was becoming more than a nuisance. It was threatening to become financially damaging. On my modest pension and savings, these fines would quickly become unsustainable. More importantly, the garden that was meant to honor Linda was being twisted into something ugly and contentious. The monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for the following evening at the community center. I spent hours preparing my case, printing photographs of similar gardens in the neighborhood that had not received violations, highlighting sections of the covenant that protected homeowners' reasonable use of their property, and gathering signatures from several neighbors who supported my project. The community center meeting room was arranged like a courtroom, with the board members seated at an elevated table at the front and rows of chairs facing them. Karen sat center, a position that clearly displayed her authority. About 20 neighbors filled the chairs, most looking resigned or bored, a few glancing at me with sympathetic expressions as I took a seat in the front row. When the time came for homeowner concerns, I approached the podium with my carefully organized materials. Before I could speak more than a few sentences, Karen interrupted. "Mr. Mitchell, we are all aware of your ongoing violations," she said, her voice carrying through the room. "This meeting is not the appropriate forum for contesting properly documented infractions. Those must be submitted in writing through the appeals process, which requires a $200 filing fee." I tried again. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding about the scope of my project. If I could just explain." "There is no misunderstanding," Karen cut in sharply. "Your unauthorized excavation risks damaging critical infrastructure. Your unsightly construction materials have been visible for weeks. You failed to submit proper plans before beginning work." With each accusation, her voice grew louder. "Furthermore, you have ignored multiple notices requiring you to restore your property to its approved condition." As I attempted to present my documentation, Karen spoke over me, her voice taking on a public performance quality. This is exactly the kind of disregard for community standards that diminishes property values for everyone. Mr. Mitchell seems to think the rules do not apply to him. She looked around the room, seeking support from the other homeowners. Perhaps because he is relatively new to our community, he does not appreciate the importance of maintaining the standards that make Oak Ridge desirable. Her humiliation tactics were deliberate and effective. Several board members nodded along with her statements. By the time she finished, I felt like a scolded child rather than a homeowner with legitimate concerns. The meeting moved on to other business without addressing any of my points or allowing me to fully speak. As I gathered my documents, defeated and embarrassed, an older woman I recognized as Mrs. Abernathy from 3 doors down slipped a folded note into my hand. "Not everyone agrees with her," the note read, along with a phone number. Similar subtle gestures of support came from a few other neighbors as we filed out of the meeting room. Bill gave me a knowing look, and the young couple with twins briefly touched my arm in solidarity as they passed. In the parking lot, a man I had seen but never spoken with approached me. "Tom Ramirez," he introduced himself quietly. "I was on the board before Karen staged her takeover. What she is doing is not right. Several of us have been documenting her selective enforcement and procedural violations. Call me if you want to discuss it." He pressed his business card into my palm before walking quickly to his car. These small acts of support gave me hope. I was not alone in my frustration with Karen's regime. The next morning, I filed a formal appeal of the violations through the proper channels, paying the $200 fee from my dwindling savings. I attached detailed photographs, relevant covenant sections, precedents of approved similar projects, and a comprehensive timeline of my efforts to comply with regulations. Everything was properly notarized and submitted in triplicate as required. If Karen wanted to play by the official rules, I would demonstrate that I could navigate them as well. 3 days later, I returned home from grocery shopping to find a scene of devastation that stopped me cold. Water was gushing from the ground in my backyard, turning the garden into a muddy swamp. The water main I had carefully worked around had been cut clean through, the earth around it deliberately excavated. This was no accident or natural failure. Someone had intentionally severed the pipe. I dropped my groceries on the lawn and rushed to the backyard, wading through ankle-deep water to reach the main shutoff valve. By the time I managed to stop the flow, the damage was catastrophic. Linda's roses were uprooted and drowning in mud. The stone path I had laid by hand was washed away. The bench where I sat to feel close to her was half submerged. As I stood there, soaked and shaking with a mixture of shock and rage, I noticed something glinting in the mud near the cut pipe. I reached down and picked up a silver hair clip with a decorative K charm, the exact clip Karen always wore pinned to her bob. She had not even bothered to hide her responsibility for this destruction. I sank to my knees in the mud, water soaking through my clothes as tears mixed with the muddy water on my face. This was not just vandalism. It was a deliberate act of cruelty aimed at breaking my spirit. In that moment of devastation, something inside me hardened. This was no longer about a garden or HOA regulations. This was personal, and it demanded a response. As I knelt there among the ruins of Linda's garden, I made a decision. Karen Peterson had just declared war, and I would not be the only casualty. The next morning, I methodically documented every aspect of the destruction. I took dozens of photographs from multiple angles, capturing the cleanly cut pipe, the extensive water damage, and the ruined garden. I made detailed notes about the timeline and discovered that several neighbors had seen Karen's distinctive white SUV parked near my home during the hours I was away shopping. I filed a police report, carefully presenting the evidence without making direct accusations. The responding officer seemed skeptical at first, but his demeanor changed when I showed him the hair clip with the K charm found at the scene. Circumstantial but definitely interesting, he noted in his report. This appears to be malicious vandalism, not accidental damage. He advised me to install security cameras immediately and document any further incidents. The water damage restoration company estimated repairs would cost over $5,000, and my homeowner's insurance had a $2,500 deductible. More devastating than the financial cost was the complete destruction of Linda's memorial garden. Some of the rose varieties I had planted were limited editions that had taken months to source. The emotional toll felt immeasurable. As the initial shock gave way to determined anger, I began researching HOA regulations in depth. I spent evenings at the county records office, reviewing the original neighborhood covenant, amendments, and state laws governing homeowners associations. The documents were dense with legal terminology, but my engineering background helped me approach them systematically, looking for patterns and inconsistencies. What I discovered was surprising. The Oak Ridge HOA had failed to properly file several required annual reports with the state. Their financial disclosures showed irregularities in how fines were collected and allocated. Most importantly, many of the enforcement procedures Karen had implemented were not actually codified in the official covenant, but appeared only in a separate board guidelines document that had never been properly ratified by a homeowner vote as required by state law. I created a detailed spreadsheet tracking every violation notice issued since Karen became president. The pattern Bill had described became obvious when the data was organized chronologically. Karen did indeed target one homeowner at a time, escalating enforcement until they either capitulated completely to her demands or moved away. I was clearly her current target, and the pattern suggested the pressure would only increase. My most significant discovery came through an unexpected source. 3 days after the vandalism, I received a call from Tom Ramirez, the former board member who had approached me after the meeting. "I heard about your water pipe. This has gone too far," he said. "I have someone you should meet. He might have information that could help you." The following evening, I met Tom at a coffee shop 10 miles from our neighborhood. With him was an older man named Frank Delgado, who had worked for the county water department for 35 years before retiring. I was part of the team that installed the original water system for Oak Ridge back in 2002, Frank explained after introductions. "There are some unusual aspects to your neighborhood setup that few people know about." Frank spread out several technical diagrams on the table. Most newer developments have individual shutoff valves for each home, controlled only by the utility company, he explained. But Oak Ridge was built during a period when we were experimenting with more efficient grid systems. His weathered finger traced lines on the diagram. "There is a master control junction box located on common property at the northeast corner of the development. From there, subsections of the neighborhood can be individually controlled." The implications slowly dawned on me. So theoretically, someone with access to this control box could shut off water to sections of the neighborhood. Frank nodded. "Not just theoretically. It was designed that way for maintenance purposes. The box requires a special key, but those are not particularly difficult to obtain. I still have mine from my working days." He studied me carefully. "Why do you ask?" I did not answer directly, but my mind was already racing with possibilities. Frank continued providing details about the water system, including the fact that the pipe Karen had cut was not just my water supply but served as a connection point for her entire street, including her own home. As we were leaving, Frank pulled me aside. "One more thing you should know. The HOA has been in violation of county water regulations for years. They never completed the required safety upgrades to the control system, and they have been falsifying compliance reports." He pressed a flash drive into my hand. "Documentation is all here. Be careful how you use it." That night, I spread all my research across my dining room table: water system diagrams, HOA violation patterns, legal statutes, and Frank's documentation of compliance failures. For the first time since the vandalism, I felt a sense of control returning. Corinne had power, but she had also made mistakes. She had vulnerabilities, and she had chosen the wrong person to target. I closed my notebook with newfound resolution. The path forward was becoming clear. If Corinne thought cutting one water pipe gave her power, she had no idea what was coming. My military father had often told me, "Proper preparation prevents poor performance." Those words guided me now as I developed a multi-stage plan that would require careful timing and precise execution. This was not about petty revenge. It was about justice and protecting both myself and others from Corinne's abuse of power. The plan had several key components. First, I would need to document Corinne's vandalism beyond any reasonable doubt. Second, I would need to establish a legal foundation for challenging the HOA's authority. Third, I would need allies within the neighborhood. And finally, I would need to create leverage that would force accountability. I began by installing high-definition security cameras around my property, positioning them to cover all approach angles. The system uploaded footage directly to cloud storage and sent alerts to my phone when it detected movement. I made no attempt to hide the cameras. In fact, I wanted Corinne to see them. The cameras served dual purposes: gathering evidence and potentially deterring further vandalism. Next, I purchased the specialized equipment I would need. At a plumbing supply warehouse 30 miles away, I acquired professional-grade water system tools, including a universal utility key that would work on the neighborhood's control junction box. From a different hardware store, I bought waterproof containers, pipe repair kits, and various other materials that might prove useful. The recruitment of allies proceeded carefully. Bill next door was my first confidant, having already demonstrated his distrust of Corinne. Through him, I was introduced to a network of homeowners who had experienced Corinne's targeting firsthand. We began meeting in small groups, never in the neighborhood, sharing documentation and building a comprehensive case against her. Mrs. Abernathy, the elderly woman who had slipped me her phone number at the HOA meeting, turned out to be a retired paralegal with extensive knowledge of property law. She helped me draft formal legal notices challenging the validity of the fines levied against me and demanding proper documentation of the HOA's authority to enforce its rules. Tom Ramirez introduced me to 3 former board members who had been forced out when Corinne took control. They provided internal documents showing how she had manipulated votes, selectively enforced rules, and even altered meeting minutes to support her agenda. Each piece of evidence was carefully cataloged and copies stored in multiple secure locations. While these preparations proceeded, I continued researching the neighborhood water system. Frank Delgado's diagrams proved invaluable as I located and discreetly examined the master control junction box he had described. It was housed in an inconspicuous green metal cabinet at the edge of the community park, labeled only with a utility company number. Most residents probably walked past it daily without a second glance. Late one night, I used my flashlight to examine the interior configuration without actually manipulating any controls. The system was exactly as Frank had described: a series of clearly labeled valves controlling different sections of the neighborhood. One valve was marked Section E Hillcrest Drive, which included Karen's home and about 20 others on her street. I also created backup plans and safety measures. If my actions were discovered prematurely, I needed legal protection. I consulted with an attorney, describing the situation without revealing my specific intentions. On his advice, I prepared affidavits from neighbors who had witnessed Karen near my property on the day of the vandalism, along with an engineering analysis of the cut pipe showing it was a deliberate act, not an accident. For 2 weeks, I documented every HOA violation notice in the neighborhood, creating a map that visually displayed Karen's pattern of selective enforcement. Properties belonging to her friends or allies received no violations, while those she had conflicts with received multiple citations for identical issues. This documentation would be crucial for demonstrating her abuse of power. The final piece of preparation involved setting a trap that would trigger Karen's predictable behavior patterns. Based on her previous actions, I knew she responded aggressively to any perceived challenge to her authority. I would need to create a situation that would provoke her into overreaching while my cameras recorded everything. I decided on a simple but effective bait. I would begin rebuilding my garden, this time with a small, temporary plastic pond, in place of the permanent one I had originally planned. The installation would be technically compliant with HOA rules regarding temporary structures, but visible enough to attract Karen's attention. I would ensure she noticed it by casually mentioning my plans to neighbors I suspected of reporting to her. As I positioned the small pond in my partially restored garden, I felt a calm determination replace my earlier anger. My house was now a command center, with evidence files organized on my computer, neighborhood maps marked with strategic points, and equipment ready for deployment. Through my window, I could see Karen's house on the hill, its perfect exterior hiding the person who had caused so much pain. That evening, I stood at my window, watching as Karen slowed her car while passing my house, her head turning to observe my new garden installation. Her features tightened in visible disapproval before she continued driving. I knew it would not be long before she took the bait. The trap was set, and all the preparation was about to be tested. The confrontation came sooner than even I had anticipated. The morning after installing the temporary pond, I deliberately left for work early, activating all security cameras and positioning my car where it appeared I had left for the day. Instead, I circled back on foot through a neighbor's yard with their permission and entered my house through the back door. From my darkened living room window, I had a perfect view of my front yard and garden. I did not have to wait long. At precisely 9:17 a.m., Karen's white SUV rolled to a stop in front of my house. She emerged wearing her HOA uniform of pressed slacks and a blazer, clipboard in hand. She approached my front yard cautiously, glancing around to ensure no one was watching. When she was confident the coast was clear, she stepped directly onto my property and began photographing the temporary pond. What happened next exceeded my expectations. After documenting the violation, Karen moved to my garden hose, which I had deliberately left connected to the outdoor faucet. With a quick glance around, she turned the water on full force and positioned the hose to flood directly into the plastic pond. Then she placed a heavy rock on the hose to hold it in place, ensuring the pond would overflow and potentially cause damage. The entire sequence was captured perfectly on my security cameras. As Karen returned to her vehicle, her face showed a satisfaction that chilled me. This was not someone enforcing rules. This was someone who took pleasure in causing harm. I waited until she was gone before emerging to turn off the water, documenting the attempted vandalism with additional photographs. This evidence was the final piece I needed. That evening, I implemented the next phase of my plan. Under cover of darkness, I made my way to the water system control junction box at the edge of the community park. Using the utility key I had acquired, I silently opened the cabinet. With Frank's diagrams as my guide, I located the main valve controlling water flow to Section E, Hillcrest Drive. I paused for a moment, considering the impact of what I was about to do. This would affect not just Corinne but her neighbors as well. I had weighed this ethical dilemma carefully and made arrangements to minimize collateral damage. With a decisive